Have you ever been fined for something so ridiculous, so petty, that you almost thought it was a joke? That's exactly how my nightmare with the HOA began. I wasn't breaking the law. I wasn't disturbing the peace, and I wasn't bothering my neighbors. All I did was park my own car in my own driveway. And yet, that was enough for the Homeowners Association to slap me with a fine that would ignite a battle neither side would ever forget. It started on a quiet Monday morning. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over my neighborhood. Everything seemed perfectly normal until I opened my mailbox and found a letter stamped with the HOA's bold emblem. Inside was a notice of violation. My crime? Parking in my own driveway overnight. The paper claimed it was against the HOA's community guidelines, citing some obscure clause about maintaining uniformity in the neighborhood's appearance. To them, cars and driveways looked cluttered. To me, it looked like common sense. After all, wasn't that what driveways were for? At first, I thought it was some kind of clerical mistake. Surely, no reasonable person could actually expect homeowners to avoid using their driveways. But the fine wasn't small. It was hefty enough to sting, the kind of fee that reminded you who really held power in the neighborhood. I tried brushing it off, but by the end of the week, more letters came. They were threatening escalating penalties if I didn't comply. That's when the absurdity turned into anger. I looked around at my neighbors' homes and noticed something strange. Some of them had been parking in their driveways for years without issue. So why me? Why now? That's when the whispers started. One neighbor hinted that the HOA president, a woman named Marjorie, had been looking for someone to make an example of. She was notorious for enforcing rules with an iron fist, and apparently I had landed in her sights. The unfairness burned inside me. I had bought my home with the idea of freedom and independence. Yet here I was, being punished for using the very space I owned. It wasn't just about the money. It was about principle. If they could fine me for this, what would be next? A penalty for the color of my curtains? A fee because my lawn wasn't green enough? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't stay quiet. But what could I do? At first, I tried the polite route. I wrote an email to the HOA board, explaining that the rule was unfair and selectively enforced. Days passed. No reply. Then I attended a board meeting. Standing in front of the smug-faced committee as I voiced my frustration, they listened in silence, then brushed me off like I was wasting their time. Marjorie, sitting at the center, simply smirked and told me, "Rules are rules. If you don't like it, move." That was the moment everything changed. Her arrogance, her complete disregard for fairness, struck me harder than any fine. I walked out of that meeting with a new resolve. If they wanted to play dirty, I would fight back. But I wouldn't just fight. I would turn their own rules against them. I began by researching every line of the HOA bylaws, page after page of jargon restrictions and loopholes. And buried deep within, I found exactly what I was looking for. Nowhere did it state that cars couldn't be parked on common property overnight. The lawns and shared green spaces technically fell under this category. It was a loophole so glaring. I couldn't believe nobody had used it before. That's when the idea formed. If they wanted to stop me from parking in my own driveway, fine. I would park somewhere else. But not just anywhere. I would park in the very places they claim to protect. Their manicured lawns, their precious common grounds. And I would do it all by the book. The first night I parked my car on the HOA's prize front lawn, I felt a rush of satisfaction. It was petty, sure, but it was legal. The look on Marjorie's face the next morning was priceless. Fury, confusion, and disbelief all rolled into one. She stormed across the street, waving papers and shouting about rules. But I stood my ground. The bylaw was clear, and for once, the power was mine. What started as a single act of defiance soon spiraled into something bigger. Other neighbors, tired of the HOA's bullying, began to join me. Cars appeared on lawns and cul-de-sacs, even in front of the HOA office itself. The community was rising, and Marjorie's control was slipping through her fingers. But little did I know, this was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to back down quietly. They had tricks of their own, and Marjorie was determined to crush me no matter the cost. What followed was a war of petty fines, escalating revenge, and shocking discoveries that would tear the neighborhood apart. And it all started with a simple parking ticket in my own driveway. Have you ever seen an entire neighborhood rise up against an HOA? It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's like watching a dam finally burst after years of pressure. That's exactly what began after my first night of parking on the HOA's prize lawn. What started as a single act of defiance soon snowballed into a full-scale rebellion that Marjorie and her board never saw coming. The morning after I parked my car on the HOA's front lawn, chaos rippled through the community. Neighbors walked their dogs past my car, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smirking with approval. The news spread quickly. Someone had finally stood up to the HOA. For years, people had been quietly grumbling about unfair rules, ridiculous fines, and Marjorie's heavy-handed leadership. But nobody had dared to openly challenge her. Until now, Marjorie, of course, was livid. She stormed across the street, waving her binder of rules like it was a holy book. She shouted about violations, threatened new fines, and even hinted at legal action. But when I calmly pointed out the loophole in the bylaws, she froze. She had nothing. For once, the Queen of Control had been beaten at her own game, and everyone saw it. That small victory lit a spark across the neighborhood. People who had been quietly suffering under the HOA's tyranny suddenly felt empowered. One neighbor, who had been fined for leaving her trash can out a few hours too long, parked her minivan on the community lawn the very next night. Another, who had been penalized for planting flowers not listed on the approved species list, joined in too. Before long, the lawns that the HOA prized so much were lined with cars from frustrated residents making their own silent statements. The board scrambled to regain control. Letters flew out of their office, warning of community chaos and devaluation of property values. But by then, the damage was done. The more they tried to tighten their grip, the more people resisted. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't feared. It was mocked. Marjorie, however, wasn't about to let her authority crumble. She called an emergency board meeting, gathering her loyal committee members in a desperate attempt to regain control. I wasn't invited, of course, but word spread quickly. She was pushing for a complete rewrite of the bylaws, one that would ban parking on common grounds and give the HOA sweeping new powers to tow vehicles at will. It was a power grab, plain and simple. That's when I realized the stakes had just been raised. This wasn't about a fine anymore. It wasn't even about parking. This was about control. Marjorie wanted absolute power, and if she got her way, nobody in the neighborhood would ever be safe from her reach again. So I began to dig deeper. I started looking into the HOA's finances, something most residents never bothered to question. What I found was shocking. Hidden in the budget reports were vague administrative fees and miscellaneous expenses that didn't add up. Thousands of dollars unaccounted for, all signed off by Marjorie herself. Was she siphoning money from the community? The evidence was thin, but it raised questions I knew she didn't want asked. Meanwhile, the rebellion in the neighborhood grew louder. People started organizing informal gatherings, comparing stories of unfair treatment and ridiculous fines. For the first time, we weren't just neighbors. We were allies. And every news story of abuse only fueled our determination to push back. But Marjorie wasn't finished with me. A week after the rebellion began, I came home to find a certified letter taped to my door. Inside was a formal cease and desist order, accusing me of inciting community disorder and willful property damage. According to her, my actions were ground for legal action and even eviction. Eviction from a home I owned. The audacity left me speechless. Yet, instead of scaring me, her threat only confirmed what I already knew. She was desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. The neighborhood was now at a breaking point. The lawns were filled with cars, the community was divided, and the HOA was scrambling to hold on to power. But behind all the noise, I had uncovered something far more dangerous than parking violations. I had stumbled onto what looked like the first cracks in a much larger scandal. And if I was right, exposing it wouldn't just end the fines. It could destroy Marjorie and the entire HOA board. Have you ever pulled on a loose thread, only to find a whole fabric unravel in your hands? That's exactly what happened when I started digging into the HOA's finances. What began as a fight over driveway parking was now spiraling into something much bigger. Something that would expose the rotten core of the association and put Marjorie's empire on the edge of collapse. After receiving that bogus cease and desist letter, I knew I couldn't just play defense anymore. If Marjorie wanted war, I had to go on the offensive. So I spent night after night combing through every document I could get my hands on: budgets, expense reports, board meeting notes, and archived newsletters. It was tedious work, but slowly, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The HOA collected thousands of dollars in annual dues from every household, money that was supposed to go toward maintenance, landscaping, and community projects. But according to the reports, only a fraction of that money was accounted for. The rest had been funneled into vague categories like administrative costs and special project allocations. The numbers didn't lie. Funds were disappearing. And at the center of every signature, every approval, was one name: Marjorie. At first, I wondered if it was just sloppy bookkeeping. But then I found the smoking gun. Buried in a quarterly report was a payment to a consulting firm that didn't exist. A quick search confirmed it. The business was fake, a shell company registered under the name of Marjorie's cousin. Suddenly, everything clicked. She wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was using her position to siphon money straight into her family's pockets. It was the kind of corruption that could ruin reputations, careers, and even lead to criminal charges. But exposing it wouldn't be easy. Marjorie had the board in her pocket, and anyone who challenged her usually ended up buried in fines and legal threats. If I wanted to take her down, I needed more than just suspicions. I needed undeniable proof. Meanwhile, the neighborhood rebellion was still growing. Cars continued to fill the lawns every night, a symbol of defiance against the HOA's tyranny. People were angry, but they were also hopeful. For the first time, they saw that Marjorie's grip on power wasn't unbreakable. Every small act of resistance added fuel to the fire, and the community's spirit grew stronger with each passing day. But Marjorie wasn't backing down. She doubled the fines, threatened lawsuits, and even tried to tow cars without proper authorization. Her desperation was showing, and it only made her look weaker. Still, I knew she was dangerous. If she caught wind of my investigation, she'd come after me harder than ever before. So I kept quiet, pretending to play the role of the rebellious homeowner while secretly gathering evidence. I started talking to former board members, people who had mysteriously resigned after clashing with Marjorie. Their stories painted a clear picture of her manipulation, how she bullied dissenters, silenced complaints, and covered up financial discrepancies with intimidation tactics. The more I learned, the more I realized she wasn't just running a bad HOA. She was running a personal fiefdom built on fear and greed. And then came the breakthrough. One evening, while reviewing old emails that a former treasurer had saved, I found direct correspondence between Marjorie and her cousin's fake consulting firm. She had instructed him to inflate invoices, pad expenses, and funnel the leftover funds into a private account. It was all there in black and white. This wasn't speculation anymore. It was proof of fraud. But holding that information in my hands was both empowering and terrifying. On one hand, I had the weapon that could bring her entire operation crashing down. On the other, I knew that once I moved, there would be no turning back. Marjorie wouldn't just roll over and accept defeat. She would fight tooth and nail to protect her empire, and I had to be ready for the storm that was coming. I decided to share my findings with a small circle of trusted neighbors, the ones who had been most vocal in the rebellion. When they saw the evidence, their jaws dropped. Suddenly, our fight wasn't just about parking fines or garden rules. It was about justice. We weren't just standing up for ourselves anymore. We were standing up for the integrity of the entire community. But just as we began planning our next move, Marjorie struck first. Late one night, a new set of violation notices was delivered to multiple homes, including mine. This time, the fines weren't just absurd. They were astronomical. Thousands of dollars in penalties, threats of property liens, and warnings of foreclosure. It was her most aggressive move yet, a clear attempt to scare us into submission. The message was obvious. back down, or she'd destroy us financially. But she didn't realize that fear was no longer her weapon. The neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. We were angry. And anger, when united, is far more powerful than intimidation. With the proof of her corruption in my hands and the community rallying behind me, I knew the next chapter of this battle would be decisive. We weren't just fighting fines anymore. We were preparing to bring down the entire HOA board. And soon, the whole world would know the truth about Marjorie. Have you ever felt the tension of an entire room holding its breath, waiting for a secret to be revealed? That's exactly what it felt like when the day of the HOA's emergency board meeting arrived. For weeks, the neighborhood had been buzzing with rumors, defiance, and resistance. Cars were still parked on the lawns. Fines were piling up, and Marjorie's threats were getting louder. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that would finally bring her corruption into the light. The board had called this meeting to restore order in the community. Flyers were slipped under doors, emails were blasted out, and Marjorie herself promised a reckoning for the rebels. She wanted to intimidate us, to make an example of me and the other homeowners who dared to resist. But what she didn't know was that this meeting wouldn't end with her victory. It would end with her exposure. The community hall was packed that evening. Neighbors filled every chair, with some standing along the walls. You could feel the divide in the room. On one side, Marjorie and her loyal board members sat stiffly behind a long table, their faces cold and calculated. On the other, the rebellious homeowners whispered among themselves, their frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Marjorie opened the meeting with her usual arrogance. She lectured the crowd about maintaining standards and preserving property values. She waved around violation letters and threatened more fines, foreclosures, even lawsuits. Her voice carried the smug confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. But this time, she wasn't the only one with a microphone. When it was my turn to speak, I walked in front of the room with a folder in my hands, the folder that contained every piece of evidence I had gathered. The crowd fell silent. Marjorie's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of unease in her expression. I started by reminding everyone why we were there, not because of parking or driveways, but because of abuse of power. I spoke about the unfair fines, the intimidation, the constant harassment. Heads nodded in agreement, voices murmured in support. And then I dropped the bombshell. I revealed the financial discrepancies, the fake consulting firm, the inflated invoices. I explained how the money meant for community projects had been funneled away into private pockets. And finally, I showed the emails, direct proof of Marjorie's fraud. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even shouts of outrage filled the air. Neighbors who had once been afraid of speaking out were now emboldened. The evidence was undeniable. Marjorie tried to fight back. She stood, red-faced, accusing me of fabricating documents, of waging a personal vendetta. But the harder she shouted, the more desperate she sounded. And when one of the former treasurers in the audience stood up and confirmed my findings, the last shred of her credibility collapsed. The board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were on the sinking ship with her. Some tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance. Others sat in stunned silence. The balance of power had shifted right before everyone's eyes. But Marjorie wasn't finished. In a last-ditch attempt to cling to control, she declared that the documents were under review and threatened legal action against anyone who spread them further. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, leaving the board and the entire neighborhood in chaos. In that moment, we knew the battle wasn't over. The exposure had shaken her, but she was too arrogant and too entrenched to step down quietly. She would fight back with everything she had, lawyers, threats, and maybe even more lies. But now she was cornered, and everyone knew the truth. The neighborhood had reached a turning point. No longer divided. We were united in our determination to end her reign once and for all. The rebellion had transformed into a movement, and Marjorie was standing on borrowed time. What happened next would decide everything. The future of the community, the fate of the HOA, and whether justice would finally be served. And as the sun set on that explosive night, one thing was certain. The final battle with Marjorie was coming, and it would be the showdown of a lifetime. Have you ever watched a bully realize, too late, that their power is gone? That was the moment our neighborhood had been waiting for. The fall of Marjorie, the queen of fines, fear, and fraud. The rebellion had grown. The truth had been revealed, and now all that remained was the final act of justice. After the explosive board meeting, the HOA was in chaos. Neighbors who once stayed silent were suddenly vocal, demanding accountability. Former board members came forward with more evidence of shady practices. The walls around Marjorie's empire were crumbling, and she knew it. But instead of stepping down gracefully, she doubled down. Within days, she hired an attorney and sent out official letters threatening lawsuits against anyone who defamed her name. It was her last attempt to scare us into silence. But the threats fell flat. People weren't afraid anymore. In fact, they were furious. For years, we had endured her petty fines, her arrogance, and her iron-fisted control. Now that we knew she had been stealing from us, the anger turned into something stronger, resolve. We weren't going to let her bury this. So we organized. Neighbors gathered in living rooms and backyards, pooling information, planning strategies. We started a petition demanding her immediate removal, and within days, signatures flooded in. Nearly every household in the neighborhood signed it, except for Marjorie's few loyalists. The petition alone was enough to call for a special vote of no confidence, but we weren't stopping there. I contacted local media outlets, anonymously at first. When reporters got wind of the scandal, an HOA president accused of fraud and financial misconduct, they jumped on it. News vans appeared in the neighborhood, cameras rolling as residents voiced their frustrations. For the first time, Marjorie's dirty laundry wasn't just a neighborhood issue. It was public. The pressure mounted. Investigators from the city's housing department began looking into the HOA's finances. Subpoenas were issued, accounts were examined, and a paper trail led right where we knew it would, straight to Marjorie and her cousin's fake consulting firm. The final board meeting under her rule was unforgettable. The hall was packed again, but this time the energy was different. It wasn't fear or uncertainty, it was anticipation. Marjorie walked in looking pale, her confidence gone, clutching a stack of papers as if they could shield her from what was coming. When the vote was called, the result was overwhelming. The board, under public pressure, had no choice but to remove her as president. And when the financial investigation findings were read aloud, the room gasped. Not only had she siphoned thousands of dollars from HOA funds, but she had also used community money to pay for personal vacations and luxury items. It was outright theft. The authorities took it from there. By the end of the week, Marjorie was facing charges of fraud and embezzlement. Her once feared presence in the neighborhood was reduced to a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power is abused. The neighborhood, meanwhile, transformed. Without Marjorie's iron grip, people began working together again. The lawns once used as protest parking spots became spaces for block parties and community gatherings. The fines disappeared, the intimidation ended, and the HOA was restructured under new leadership, fair, transparent, and accountable. As for me, I parked my car back in my driveway, the very place this entire battle began. There were no fines, no threats, no angry letters, just peace and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. And here's the real truth. This story isn't just about one HOA, one president, or one neighborhood. It's about standing up to unfairness, refusing to be bullied, and fighting for what's right, even when the odds feel stacked against you. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person parking in the wrong place to spark a revolution. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping HOA dramas, outrageous Karen tales, and real-life revenge stories. Your support keeps these stories alive. And trust me, the next one will be even wild.